Welcome to this explainer. Right, let's just jump straight into it. Today, we're taking a really deep, reflective look at something that literally shapes our modern world, but honestly, it usually just gets boiled down to abstract statistics or those fleeting headlines you scroll past. We are talking about displacement. We're going to step away from the massive, impersonal numbers and actually look at the profound human cost of armed conflict. Because at the end of the day, our goal here is to understand exactly how war systematically interrupts and honestly shatters the very fabric of human everyday life.
Okay, let's dive into this with a quote you've probably heard before. Military theorist Karl von Clausewitz famously defined war as the continuation of politics by other means. Now, it's a super famous, very analytical statement, right? But here's the thing. This cold, big-picture perspective completely ignores the micro-level tragedy. It frames war as just another tool of the state, but it entirely misses what that tool actually does to the real people standing right in its way.
Because, for everyday people, war absolutely isn't politics. It is a profound, total rupture of human existence. For civilians, it means the violent uprooting from ancestral homes. It means a sudden and terrifying end to all those deeply ingrained daily routines we take for granted. War is not a chess match. It's a catalyst for unimaginable upheaval that literally forces individuals to abandon everything they know just to survive.
Which brings us to Section 1, the mechanics of upheaval. War as an engine of physical disruption.
To really grasp the scale of this rupture, we need to zoom out for a second and look at the operational realities of modern warfare and how they systematically force mass migration. It usually starts with terms we hear on the news all the time, like collateral damage. Now, this is a highly sanitized military term, isn't it? In the operational reality of modern war, which involves heavy artillery and aerial bombardments right next to civilian areas, collateral damage is just the technical label for the unintended harm to human lives and infrastructure. But let's be clear, unintended definitely does not mean unfelt.
Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast between that sanitized definition we just heard and the terrifying reality on the ground. When we strip away all the military jargon, the actual reality of collateral damage is horrifying. We are talking about the deafening roar of continuous explosions. We're looking at the total collapse of family homes and local markets, the very places that actually sustain a community. It means agonizing, desperate searches for loved ones in the rubble. This immense psychological and physical destruction, that is what fundamentally compels everyday people to flee.
Then there's another major mechanical driver of displacement: area denial. Basically, this is a military strategy used to prevent an adversary from operating in a specific region. And how do they pull this off? Well, through persistent shelling, laying down landmines, or the strategic bombardment of critical infrastructure. Militaries deliberately target the power grids, the water treatment facilities, the transportation networks, all to cripple the enemy's capacity. But in doing that, they completely decimate the entire civilian ecosystem.
And the human reality of that area denial, it's just catastrophic. You have entire populations plunged into a perpetual state of darkness. There is a desperate scarcity of clean water, which of course immediately invites disease. Communication completely breaks down. People in these regions aren't just fleeing the direct kinetic bombing. They're being forced into agonizing choices. They have to evacuate simply to avoid starvation and widespread illness, simply because their own environment has been deliberately rendered totally uninhabitable.
Which brings us to a tactic with a very, very long history: siege warfare. This relies on the imposition of blockades. The goal is to starve a besieged entity into submission by cutting off all essential supplies. And while the ostensible target of a blockade is always the opposing military force, the undeniable reality of this strategy is that it invariably traps, punishes, and starves the innocent people who just happen to live within that besieged zone. I want to let the weight of these granular details sit with you for just a second. When you look at personal accounts from populations under siege, they describe extreme, widespread hunger. They talk about the horrific necessity of eating non-edible items just for basic sustenance, all while enduring this agonizing wait for relief that, honestly, may never actually arrive. It's a direct cause and effect relationship. Military blockades systematically deprive people of resources, collapsing normal life entirely and forcing literally anyone who can escape to completely abandon their home.
Let's move on to Section 2, the lived experience, plunging into psychological devastation.
So now that we understand the macro mechanics, we've got to bridge into the micro. Displacement is not just a single isolated event. Not at all. It is a continuous, cascading unraveling of a person's entire life. Just think about it. In the first hour, you lose your physical home and shelter. By week 1, as the total chaos of flight sets in, you lose your community, and you often get separated from your extended family. And by year 1, living in some new, unfamiliar place, you begin to lose your cultural identity and traditions. It is this progressive, brutal stripping away of everything that makes you you.
So the crucial point is that this cascading loss leaves hidden, deeply enduring scars. One of the most profound is something psychologists call moral injury. This is the severe psychological distress resulting from actions, or even the failure to act, that conflict with deeply held moral beliefs. In the absolute chaos of forced displacement, people are literally forced to make impossible choices just for survival. We're talking about leaving behind elderly family members who can't walk, or having to abandon a neighbor. And those impossible choices, they fracture the human psyche long after the physical danger has actually passed.
But it goes beyond the internal mind. War completely erodes the external social fabric too. Displacement causes the incredibly chaotic separation of parents and children at border crossings. It destroys those established social support networks that we all rely on during a crisis. Things like religious rituals and traditional practices are suddenly disrupted, simply because there are no longer communal spaces to gather in. And underneath all of that, there is this constant, heartbreaking yearning for the familiar smells and sounds of a homeland. It truly is a profound state of cultural alienation and isolation.
All right, Section 3, the military dilemma, the cold calculus of decision-making.
Now you might be wondering, how do military commanders even rationalize these outcomes? Well, they are faced with what is basically the impossible math of international humanitarian law. On one hand, the principle of distinction binds them to actively separate combatants from civilians. But on the other hand, proportionality demands ensuring that the military advantage actually outweighs the incidental civilian loss. And this brilliantly illustrates the tension, right? Because in the fog and chaos of an actual battle, applying these neat theoretical concepts is incredibly difficult. And as personal accounts of displacement constantly show us, the execution of this math frequently and tragically fails the civilian.
Take, for instance, the modern military doctrine of shock and awe. The whole goal here is to overwhelm an adversary with rapid, intense firepower to break their will to resist. Now, while the tactical intention might be to target military infrastructure and leadership, the sheer speed and overwhelming nature of this violence creates massive disorientation. It's so rapid and so intense that it leaves civilians with absolutely zero time for reasoned decision-making or any kind of organized evacuation, which, for sure, guarantees mass displacement.
In this dilemma, it's magnified exponentially in urban warfare. It presents a whole series of absolute nightmare scenarios. You have combatants operating in extremely close proximity to civilian families. Vital urban shelter infrastructure gets destroyed simply by the very nature of fighting within city limits. And then tragically, there's the reprehensible use of unwilling civilians as human shields by armed doctors. Honestly, warfare in densely populated areas significantly heightens civilian vulnerability and practically guarantees that millions of people will be displaced. Let's transition over to Section 4, the quest for stability, rebuilding shattered lives.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Because what actually happens when the guns finally stop? Well, we have to look at the aftermath. Even when peace is officially declared, the physical danger is far from over. Unexploded ordnance, or UXO, and landmines represent a massive lingering threat. They literally render vast tracts of ancestral land entirely unusable. You end up with farmers who can't cultivate their fields and kids who can't just go out and play freely. These hidden remnants of war mean the landscape remains incredibly hostile, completely preventing displaced people from truly ever returning home. And because of this, the whole concept of stability becomes incredibly complex. The path to rebuilding is just an arduous journey. Step 1 is simply securing immediate shelter and avoiding disease in a refugee camp. Step 2 is trying to somehow restore an economic livelihood, very often while trying to navigate language barriers and discrimination in a totally new environment. Step 3 is that intense, solitary journey of processing collective trauma. And then Step 4 is trying to forge a renewed sense of identity and belonging. More often than not, these individuals are forced to build entirely new lives in foreign lands where they are constantly viewed as outsiders.
Which really leaves us with a final, haunting question, doesn't it? If war systematically dismantles the very conditions required for human habitation, whether that's through destroyed infrastructure, unexploded landmines, or just profound psychological trauma, how do we finally break the cycle of displacement? The narratives we've explored in this explainer today, they aren't just stories. They are absolutely vital sources of knowledge. They challenge all of us to reflect on the immense human cost of military aggression, and they really underscore the absolute, urgent imperative for lasting peace. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.